Hello, everybody. This is Gary. Today is Saturday, September 28th, 2019. It's 3:10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the United States in Rochester, New York. And this is my coping with schizophrenia vlog entry for today. Um, One of the things I was always grateful for, even though I have a mental illness, a psychotic mental illness, was that I never really became homeless. I always had a roof over my head even if I changed where I was living a lot of times, and I have for different reasons, including evictions, I've never been truly homeless. But I wanted to do a video on why there are so many mentally ill people who are homeless. Of course, not all homeless people are mentally ill. Um, and why have there been so many mass shooters um, who might have mental problems? Why does mass shooting seem to go be on the rise for the past, I don't know, say 20 years? It's gotten worse over time. I remember in my mind, the whole thing began with Columbine when those kids shot up their school and were trying to set off explosives. It seemed to start at that particular incident, and then just kept increasing as the 20 years went by. Um, so, why are there so many homeless, mentally ill people? Um, the answer to that goes back to the 1960s with the civil rights movement, feminism, and other uh, human rights campaigns. There became a belief that mentally ill people should be treated outside of a hospital. They should not be institutionalized. It was sort of a virtue of people who wanted to get people out of mental hospitals for their civil rights. It was a well intentioned action to get rid of all the hospitals that held the mentally ill, but they were misguided in trying to help the mentally ill by getting them out of the hospitals because it was called the deinstitutionalization, and I believe it started with John F. Kennedy as president of the United States. They planned to release mentally ill people from state hospitals and private hospitals, but mostly from state hospitals and asylums, to be treated in the community. There was supposed to be community supports set up as people were being let out of the hospital, and those community services weren't anywhere near capable of handling the tens of thousands of mentally ill people who were being released from state and private hospitals. Deinstitutionalization was well intentioned but poorly executed. And the result has been mentally ill people becoming homeless. If they're not in a state hospital, in some cases a private hospital, for like 10 or 20 years, and then you just suddenly release them, of course they're going to be homeless. They have no idea how to cope with anything outside the hospital. I mean, some mentally ill people were in those hospitals for 20 or 30 years or more. Um, and the reason they tried to believe that they could treat all these mentally ill people in the community was the recent, in the 1960s, the recent um, discover and manufacture of antipsychotic drugs like Thorazine, um, the development of antidepressants for the first time, and the development of anti anxiety agents. It was believed that these drugs were very helpful, they weren't particularly addictive, and they could be given on a community basis, and people who came out of the mental hospitals would be able to take their medicine and adjust to living outside the hospital. And deinstitutionalization didn't just happen in the 60s, it went on all the way up through the 90s because Rochester Psychiatric Center, where I live, was the local state hospital, and it had nearly 1,000 patients in it, and a lot of them were there for decades. And then they suddenly closed the hospital, and that just created a lot of homeless people who end up in jails. So the idea of trying to close mental hospitals was for civil rights, to get rights and normalcy for mentally ill people, and to save money. The state didn't want to be in the business of mental health care. Um, but their attempt to save money and release people only makes mentally ill people commit crimes because they're not on their meds. They go to jail, and then they're isolated and given their medications in jail. I mean, if they committed a crime, they belong in jail, but the whole thing could have been avoided if they were never released from the hospitals in the first place. So the new asylums are the county jails and the state prisons of the United States, and in some cases, I guess the federal prisons. Um, Mentally ill people causing problems and committing crimes and being agitated in public often leads them into jail, which is not less expensive than keeping them in mental institutions and state hospitals like Rochester Psychiatric Center. It's actually more expensive to have to deal with the mentally ill when they've committed a crime. They have to go to jail. They have to go through a trial. They have to go through sentencing if they're found guilty. All of this costs much, much more money than ever they spent on state hospitals. It was a misguided and foolish attempt to protect the civil rights for mentally ill people and let them be free and outside of what were often considered snake pits, state hospitals. Well-intentioned but misguided. Deinstitutionalization has done nothing but create a lot of mess of homeless people and a mess of mass shooters who are not in treatment. And maybe if they had been in a hospital, they never would have become mass shooters. So there you have it. The reason there are so many mentally ill homeless people is because of deinstitutionalization and poor planning for community support for the mentally ill. There's still not enough clinics to treat the mentally ill in the community. In some clinics that I've been in, were overwhelmed with the number of outpatients that were coming in and trying to get treatment. It was like shoulder to shoulder crowded in one clinic I went to. I believe it was called Evelyn Brandon Community Center. But we had classes every day, 4 to 5 days out of the week. And the rooms that we were in were like very crowded because in the United States, you can't refuse mentally ill people from treatment despite the fact they may not be able to pay for it. So you have an overload of all these different patients or clients or whatever you want to call them into outpatient clinics and holding classes when there's so many people barely can fit into a room. So there's still no community support for the people who are mentally ill. I myself avoided homelessness just by taking my meds, and it's probably the biggest factor that makes homeless people homeless is they don't take the medication. And so they might have a run-in with their landlords, or even if they owned a house, they might have problems paying for it. But the mentally ill got screwed starting in the 60s and up through the 90s. There's a smaller state hospital in Rochester, New York. It only has, I believe, 100 patients in it as compared to the 1,000 they had before. And they only put the most extreme cases in the state hospital to be watched long-term for more than 3 months, inpatient. So a lot of the homeless mentally ill would not be able to go to Rochester Psychiatric Center because it's just too small. They don't have enough beds. And you have to be somebody who requires long-term care because you may be dangerous to yourself or others. And you can get into Rochester Psychiatric Center if you're a long-term case that has to be watched and treated, which excludes most mentally ill people. But the homeless mentally ill problem needs to be addressed, even if that means going back to the hospital system and reinstitutionalize those people who are not able to make it out on their own on the streets. Like I said, I'm grateful that I was never homeless. I spent 30 days in a homeless shelter, but I don't consider that being homeless because even then I had a roof over my head. So that's about it. That's just my rambling and bitching for today. And that's why there's so many mentally ill people who are homeless. With all these mass shootings and mentally ill, like the homeless in Los Angeles is like 80,000 people, 50,000, 80,000 people, and a good chunk of them are mentally ill. The federal government needs to do something about hospitalizing people on a long term basis because the states, including California, don't seem willing to do it. So I hope President Trump addresses the issues of mentally ill on a federal level and comes up with some solutions that both Democrats and Republicans can work together on in helping the homeless mentally ill people by truly having a place for them to stay, whether that's a hospital or renting a room or whatever it might be. I think the federal government's intervention is necessary. I know a lot of people don't like the government getting into the business of private citizens, big government, and all that. But state governments have completely failed the mentally ill, and the federal government needs to do something about it. So that's my bitching for today. I'm all done. Like, subscribe, comment, share, uh, say whatever you want, or give me whatever suggestions. I don't censor comments. I welcome them, even critical ones.